All right, just once again want to thank you guys for your time and hearing us out. My name is Eric Lombardi and I'm the president of More Neighbours Toronto, and this is Bilal, who is a board member, and we'd like to give you this presentation and our point of view on the budget. Just going to go to the next slide. Just an FYI, we are a housing advocacy group that's seeking to end the housing crisis in Toronto. And our next slide is an agenda, which I'm going to just get to the presentation so we don't waste time on it. We're excited to see that Toronto is finally putting its fiscal house in order. If you actually look at the property taxes that are proposed in this budget, it's only $40 per month. And when you actually look at the history of rental price increases in Toronto, we've actually seen $130 per month per annum for about the last 7 or 8 years. And so, let's relax a little bit about what this actually does mean for homeowners. If you also look at the budget, this move helps show to other levels of government that Toronto is serious about balancing the budget and positions the city well in its bargaining power and political negotiations over long-term sustainable funding for the city, and that's something we support. Next slide. We also support the federal portion of the property tax levy. Asylum seekers are a national responsibility, and therefore, since so many refugees and asylum seekers come to Toronto, it is incumbent upon us and the federal government to support them. But that being said, next slide, it is still a bit of town hall tomfoolery. And the reason for this is we've been watching chronic homelessness rise in the city. And a large part of the reason for this is that we have an ongoing housing crisis that this city has neglected to address with its own policies. This council, for a very long time, has been very slow to react to these issues. And one of the reasons why we don't have enough space in our shelter system is because we have not been proactive in ensuring that we have adequate affordable housing capacity broadly in our city's economy. Next slide. We've been bad on housing, and even if you look at recent initiatives like the Housing Action Plan put forward last March, we were already behind on almost every element within it. We're not even a year in and we're already a year behind. This situation is ridiculous. And further, there have been opportunities lately for this council to come forward with bold recommendations and changes on housing. As recently as December 13th, City Hall put forward its own Housing Affordability Fund application to the federal government, and the city proposed basically nothing. And we had to argue to the federal government that, we should have our funding rejected because it wasn't bold enough. We didn't like doing that, but we need to be ambitious as a city, and this council still isn't being ambitious on this issue with opportunities that it does have.
Yeah, so Eric emphasized how the city hasn't been bold enough to address this housing crisis head on, and how we find ourselves in this fiscal cliff, in this sort of deep hole that we're in because of our inability to house people. But what does the city have in its own toolbox that it doesn't need to beg other governments for? Well, property taxes. I know the city council has mentioned repeatedly that property taxes are not the most perfect tool, but here I am to tell you that it is a more effective tool than you might realize. We are very glad to see that we're going towards a place where property taxes are harmonized between multi-residential, single residential, and even commercial. But really, if you look at that table at the bottom, that table represents the ratio of each of those tax classes relative to single residential. That multi-residential row should already be at 1.0 right now, and it is at 1.82 if you can't see it. This is unfair. This is very unfair for renters who pay more property tax through their rent, through a rental housing shortage, and in other ways, because purpose-built rental is taxed so much more than single residential is. That is something the city has the power to address through raising taxes on single residential to bring this in line, and yet this is where we are. The other way, the city can advocate more strongly for reassessments. As this chart shows, the values of single-family homes in the last 8 years since the last reassessment, since 2016, has grown much more than the values of apartments or of multiplexes. And by bringing impacts assessed values in line with market values, you will see a shifting of tax burden away from people living in denser dwellings and towards single-family dwellings which do tend to be populated by people with more wealth and higher incomes. That is proven in academic literature. And you don't need to do anything about that. You just need to advocate for this reassessment to happen, and then you will see that, that sort of redistribution to happen right off the bat. But there's another way in which the city has been putting away tax increases from most homeowners, and that is through development charges. Just in 2022, the city proposed a about 50% increase in development charges. Now, many of you might say, well, like normal people don't pay that, developers pay that. What a development charge does is it sets the price floor below which it makes no sense to build housing. You don't want to tax the building of homes in a housing shortage. That's like taxing vaccines in a pandemic. You want to encourage building new homes, and you may want to tax the hoarding of homes, so to speak. So in this case, we are doing the exact opposite. You are taxing the building of homes more than, and you're increasing, by you, I'm not referring to just you, I'm referring to the city historically and in the present, has generally taxed building homes way more than existing homes. And that's just development charges. There are other ways in which newcomers, new homeowners pay sort of an admission fee to be a homeowner, which is land transfer taxes. It started off as being something that was low because property values when land transfer taxes were introduced were low. But over the years, like today, a new condo homeowner is going to pay multiple years worth of property tax as land transfer tax. And the box on the right shows that, like, if you remove all of these taxes away, what the reduction in prices for those high-rise multi-residential units, it makes those units much more attainable, up from just to the top 4th percentile in incomes up to 22 percentiles. Now, some of you might say, well, developers can charge whatever the market will bear. They won't, lower prices just because taxes are going down. Well, math affects everything. And if you reduce taxes, more and more cheaper homes will also be viable to build, which are not penciling right now. And the city fails to see its own problems because most of our land is still zoned for low rise. Like, yes, we passed multiplexes last year, but in a lot of neighborhoods that do have a lot of surplus infrastructure, like schools, like good transit access, like you can see on the map over here. This is a map of population change since 1970 till 2016. And you can see all those places in red have lost population since 1970. These are very well located neighborhoods with some of the best schools in the country, with some of the best transit access in the city itself. And yet all our growth has been relegated to some places like downtown below Queen Street, the Bay Young Corridor, Young and Eglinton, and so on, while the rest of the city has lost population. This is why we are in the fiscal depth, in the deep hole that we are in, is because we have experienced a lot of degrowth in most of the city. And Eric will take it from here.
We want a future where we can have high quality public services in a reasonable tax base. And every time the budget comes up, we say, well, how can we do more with less? And when city returns say, well, no, it's not really possible, our choice are more taxes or less services. But the secret third option is that we can build more density in the places that have shirked their responsibility to grow for the last few decades. Next slide. Studies show that when we actually build housing in places with existing infrastructure, we reduce the cost burden on that infrastructure development by up to 30%. And if you also include the fact that we need to deliver ongoing services to these neighborhoods, those neighborhoods are 38% cheaper to service. Wouldn't you guys love to decide what to do? Better services or less taxes instead of the state that the city is in today? Wouldn't you love that? I would. It's time for this council to embark on ambitious zoning reform, legalize 4 stories and 6 units by right, have a real mid-rise and apartment policy for neighborhoods. It's time to actually look at the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city and say, yes, you need to do more. Next slide. And go beyond that. You can even ask the province for the right to tax land value. It's something that they can provide through data that's already in MPAC, and it would be broadly beneficial for all the city's goals. So time to take action. If the city takes a leadership position, like very few governments do, you guys can position yourselves to go even beyond what you've advocated for and actually make Toronto a leader in governance. Thank you.